All right, welcome back. So today we're going to do a simple example demonstrating what we call the classic stock signal. You might have seen this idea floating around the internet for quite a long time, and many people start their technical analysis learning journey with this simple stock signal and then expand from there as they learn more. So the idea here is you've got the moving average price crossing above or below that. So in this case, we're crossing up for this signal. The MACD histogram is either above or below 0. And then we're going to look at the stochastic RSI overbought or oversold levels. So pretty straightforward, about 3 or 4 rules at most. All right, so let's bring up BloodHound here and start working. So first of all, we're going to look at the price crossing the SMA. So thankfully, we've got a crossover solver for exactly that. So we're going to say when price, change input A to price, when price crosses the SMA 14, which is what we have on the chart right now. Normally you would go in and select the SMA 14 or whatever is on the chart, but that happens to be the default for everything, so we'll leave it the way it is. So I'll plug that in. So we're getting a signal every time the price crosses below or above the SMA 14. Step 1 done. Awesome. So now let's move on to the MACD. MACD histogram, when it's above 0, we're going to allow long signals, and then vice versa for a short signal when it's below 0. So we expect this signal to disappear because it's happening when the MACD is below 0. So what we can do is actually use the threshold solver, threshold meaning when something is above or below a certain threshold level. So very well named there in my opinion. So we'll go into the indicator, select the MACD, double click. We want to make sure all the settings match what's on the chart. I left things default for simplicity's sake for this video. And the diff plot is what we're looking at because that is the histogram. So we'll hit OK. Let's plug that in by itself. You see, when I plug one in, it takes over the other because only one thing can funnel in to the result node at the same time. We'll get into combining these in a second. So the threshold by itself, let's make sure that's working. So we've got every time it goes above 0, we're getting a long signal, and when it dips below 0, we're getting a short. Awesome. And that is acting, or it's going to act, as a permissive filter. It's saying only allow my other signals when they match this histogram direction or side of the 0. Let's actually plug these in right now and see how that works. So we're going to use an AND node. So under the logic menu, AND, when we plug in our original crossover, let's just run that. That's all we have is our original crossover right now. And when I add the threshold, the MACD threshold, we're expecting this signal to disappear because it does not match the side, the MACD signal. And this one I expect to disappear too because, again, it's a short signal, but the MACD is above 0, and so they don't match, so we're going to exclude them. So let's plug that in and watch those signals. There they go. Those two disappeared, and then a few others did as well. Awesome. So now we're saying cross while the MACD is on the right side. So for this classic stock signal, the stochastic RSI is our last rule when it's overbought or oversold. And those are just threshold levels, right? So when it's above a certain level or below a certain level, those are thresholds. Let's select the indicator and type in Stoch RSI. Double click, make sure the settings match what's on the chart. It's got one plot, so we're good to go. Now, if I plug that in right now, it's not going to be right because the threshold looks at a 0 level by default. But what we need to do is go into the output settings. And that's actually why the MACD threshold just worked, is because it defaults to a 0 value. And so, of course, that happened to be what we were looking for. But in this case, we're going to customize our output settings by going to the threshold rules here. And the way this works is we're looking at long and short conditions. For a long, when the Stoch RSI is greater than, in this case, 0 is what it defaults to, then give us a long output. That's 1 or 100%, a full long signal. But actually, what we want for a long is when it's below, if we look on the chart, 0.2 is this lower sort of over sold red line, and 0.8 is the short level that we want. When it's above that, we want a short signal for overbought. So we'll swap these around. Let's go, if it's below, actually let's do less than or equal to. Yeah, so less than or equal to a value of 0.2, then, and let's just apply it, see how that looks. Then we get a long signal. So every time it dips below that line, we get a long signal every single time and on every bar. So it's not just when it crosses, but on every bar in which that's true. Okay, so we'll do that for short as well. So we'll go greater than, so when the Stoch RSI is greater than 0.8, we're expecting a short signal. Okay, we'll hit OK. And let's plug that into the rest of our system. So let's return to what we had before, see the cross and the MACD together. When I add this, I assume some signals will disappear. All the signals disappeared. Okay. Now, this is actually pretty common. So a lot of people, when they're working with especially these really distinct areas, especially for overbought, oversold, I often see people say, you know what? I don't need them to happen on the same bar. Because that's what's happening right now, right? When we say this guy, and this guy all need to be producing the same signal at the same time, that's what the AND node is saying. What we're actually saying is they need to be happening on the same bar. Now that can be a little too rigid for certain systems like this. And so what we can do is say, you know what? The Stoch RSI condition, I just care that it happened recently. So they don't need to happen on the exact same bar. I just care that they happened within the last, say, 5 bars. If it dipped below 0.2 sometime in the last 5 bars, then give me a long signal if my other conditions are met. That can be done, but we need to extend its signal forward in time so that those future bars can work with that. Let's go ahead and add it, and then we can talk it through. So we're going to use the signal extender on that threshold solver. Let's set it to a really low number so I can sort of demonstrate what's going on. And I'm going to plug it in through that and directly. So we're saying, we're going to unplug that. So now we're just looking at the Stoch RSI condition. And we're saying, give us a signal and extend every signal forward in time by in this case, 2 bars, right? So every time it goes above 0.8 up here, we're getting a short. But you'll notice that we're still getting short signals when it dips below 0.8 for a bar or 2. Above and then down below, next bar, we're getting signals still. Basically giving those next 2 bars knowledge of that recent fact. These next 2 bars now know that sometime in the last few bars, there was a Stoch RSI condition, and so we can then combine that with the rest of our rules and say, yeah, sometime recently that rule was met. I hope that makes sense, but as you start doing this, it becomes more and more intuitive. Now, I have generally found, just for this particular system, it's kind of nice to set this to a value of 5, and then we'll plug it in. So let's go back to our AND node. Now, when we plug this in, I expect at least some signals to still be there because it's more flexible. We're saying, yes, there was a crossover. Yes, it happened at the same time that the MACD was above 0. But we also require that sometime in the last 5 bars, the Stoch RSI was, in the case of a long signal, oversold, right? So even though it's not currently oversold, it was recently enough for at least our preferences for this system. That's the beauty of this, is you get to decide kind of how your rules are set up. We are not here to tell you how you should do this. So this just happens to be something I've seen some people do in some cases, and then you can tinker or get rid of that rule or whatever. That's the beauty of flexibility. Okay, so one last thing that I've seen some people do here is adding a slope requirement for the SMA. This is not part of the classic stock signal, I don't think anyway, but some people say, you know what, if we're getting a long signal, I also want my moving average to be sloping up. And if we're getting a short signal, I want it to be sloping down. And so a common thing that I see is to use the slope solver, which does exactly that. It says, Looking at the SMA, which is what's in there by default, let's plug that in by itself. We're getting a long signal on every bar in which it's going up between two bars and down for a short. And what I often see is people will expand on that by just a tiny bit. And they say, you know what? I want it to be sloping by a certain amount, not just any amount. And so on this chart, I noticed that a decent level, and you can always play with this, is 0.5 ticks. So we're saying from one bar to the next, it needs to be sloping by at least 0.5 ticks. And if it's not, if it's too, I guess, flat or too close to flat, then don't pass signals through. Don't get a signal if the SMA is not moving by at least a certain amount. So by doing this, this just clears out a few possible scenarios where the SMA might be, quote, too flat according to you. And too flat, that's subjective. That's up to what you consider too much of whatever. So we're going to go with that for now and plug this into the rest of our system and see how that affects things. So we're getting long signal because it's going up. And then I expect this signal, if I'm reading that right, it looks like it's still sloping up. I expect this one to disappear because it didn't meet our slope requirement. So let's plug that in. And yes, okay, there you go. So that got rid of that short signal, which in this particular example, this one signals example, that assuming you've got your trade management rules set a certain way, that would allow this to be a pretty gosh darn good trade. But of course, there's a lot more variables involved. I couldn't say if that's a good trade or not, but at least there's potential there. Now you always want to double check, take a look at other examples. Okay, so there's a seemingly decent long signal, seemingly not great long signal there. Depending on your trade management rules, maybe a good short signal if you can survive, the big swings around there. Decent, again, if you're looking broad term. Decent long signal, again, if you're looking sort of mid-term. Yeah, so there's a lot to factor in here. There's a long term, that's a decent long signal. So again, this is just step one. BloodHound, you're just creating in theory, depending on how you want to use this, the entry signal. So if you're automating this, this would in theory be your trigger to enter a trade. But then how you handle the trade from there is really up to your rules. We obviously have lots of resources to help you learn how to create that step two, how to work in Blackbird to actually manage the trade. But this is just a simple example of the classic stock signal. So hope that was fun and have a great day.